Okay, so picture this for a second. It's like 5 in the morning, November 1918. Freezing cold. And you're in this, like, train carriage. Middle of a forest in
Oh,
France.
wow.
Right. You're surrounded by all these men, and some are exhausted, some are actually crying. But this isn't just any meeting. This is it. This is the moment they're going to sign the armistice to end World War I.
Wow. That's intense.
It is, right. And that's what we're going to, like, really dig into today. The story behind this armistice, all the politics, the personalities, and just the massive human cost of it all.
I mean, I know a little bit about World War I, but this is big.
It is. And we've got some amazing sources to work with. We've got diaries, memoirs. We even have an account from one of the Hello Girls, the women who worked the switchboards.
Right, yeah.
She was right there in the thick of it.
Wow.
And we're going to look at President Wilson's own words
Mhm.
about, like, his vision for peace.
Okay, so like setting the stage for how this armistice actually happened. Yeah, what I always find so interesting is how we can trace the journey to that exact moment.
Mhm.
It wasn't just about the signature on the paper. It was this whole clash between like big ideals and then cold, hard reality. What was happening inside Germany, those last desperate battles.
And you know what's crazy? People were still dying right up until the very end. Literally, like minutes before the armistice.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about this soldier who was killed just 1 minute before it took effect.
Oh, wow.
Heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah. And, it's like even when the war ended, it wasn't like everything magically got better, right?
Mm.
The armistice was just the beginning of a whole other set of challenges. It was more like hitting pause, not actually stopping.
Right, yeah. So to really get how they got to that armistice, we've got to rewind a bit
Okay.
and look at President Woodrow Wilson
Yeah.
and his famous 14 points.
Right. He wanted to kind of reshape the world, right? Make a peace that would actually last.
Yeah. He even called them, like, the only possible program for world peace.
He was a real idealist, that's for sure. He really believed in things like open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, things that he thought would prevent future wars.
Right.
But he wasn't naive. Like, he understood that they needed some kind of, like, global security system. That's why he was so big on the League of Nations.
Oh, yeah, like a global referee.
Exactly.
And he was not shy about getting these ideas out there.
No, not at all.
So in September 1918, the war is still raging, right? But he gives this speech at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine? This huge hall packed with people who are there to buy war bonds.
Yeah.
And Wilson uses this opportunity to just lay out his plan for peace.
Bold move.
Yeah, it was. And it's important to remember, at this point, the U.S. is, like, fully involved in the Meuse-Argonne offensive.
Right.
That was a brutal campaign, cost tens of thousands of American lives.
Yeah. While he's talking about peace, there are American families dealing with, like, the reality of war.
Exactly. And Wilson knew that. He knew he had to connect those sacrifices to something bigger, show the world, maybe even remind himself that America was fighting for more than just winning.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But while Wilson is trying to, rally everyone around this vision, Germany's in a really bad spot.
Uh-oh.
Their armies are falling apart.
Yeah.
Revolution's brewing at home.
So it's like Wilson's trying to reshape the world, but Germany's just trying to survive.
Totally different reality.
It's a real contrast, isn't it?
It is. And it makes you wonder, like, how did they even get to that point?
Yeah, how do you bridge that gap?
Right. It's like this impossible situation.
And, it's interesting to think about how, like, some of Wilson's points were a little vague, especially the ones about, colonial claims and self-determination.
Oh, right.
That vagueness, it kind of comes back to bite them later.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
So it sounds like Wilson was in a tough spot.
Oh, yeah.
He'd spent years saying that Germany was the bad guy.
Right.
But now he's got to figure out how to make sure there's justice and also a lasting peace.
Right. And he's not the only one with strong opinions about how to do that. You've got the Allied commanders, guys like Foch, Haig, Pershing. They've seen what Germany did, the devastation.
They're not exactly known for being idealistic, right?
No, not really. They were all about making sure Germany could never threaten Europe again. And for them, that meant, like, crushing their military, maybe even taking over parts of Germany.
So while Wilson's talking about a new world order, the Allied commanders are like, how do we protect ourselves?
Yeah, it's a total clash of ideologies. And that clash, it really comes to a head in the weeks leading up to the armistice.
Oh, I bet.
You've got the Allies in Germany trying to figure out the terms of peace. But here's the thing. Even though Germany's the one asking for the armistice, they still have some power.
Ah, how so?
They could make it really hard for the Allies to keep moving forward. And if the war keeps going, that means more casualties on both sides.
So how did Germany even approach Wilson about this armistice?
Well, in October 1918, they reach out to him and say, okay, we'll accept your 14 points as a starting point.
Okay.
But there was a lot of pushback inside Germany about this.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Some people saw it as surrender, like a total humiliation.
Yeah. Can you imagine the pressure they were under?
Totally.
They need to stop the fighting, but accepting Wilson's terms might mean, like, giving up a lot, losing national pride.
It was a tough spot to be in, and it only gets more intense as things go on. You've got this high-stakes diplomacy, military defeat, social unrest, and then you've got these individuals, Wilson, Foch, the German negotiators,
Wow.
trying to handle this crazy situation.
And their choices, they're going to have huge consequences.
Absolutely. What happened in those last few weeks, it shaped the peace, you know?
Right.
Really, it shaped the future of Europe. So you mentioned Germany's internal struggles, right? And that's really important here. Because while their leaders are, like, trying to get this armistice, the country is basically falling apart.
Right. Yeah, the Kaiser's losing power, unrest is everywhere.
Exactly.
I remember reading about, like a mutiny in the German Navy.
Oh, right.
What was going on with that?
Okay, so the German Naval High Command, they're desperate,
Yeah.
right? They want one last big show of force. So they order the fleet to attack the British.
Wow.
But the sailors, they're exhausted, morale is in the toilet, and they're running out of supplies. They basically see this as a suicide mission.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they weren't going to do it.
So what, they just refused to go? That's incredibly risky.
It was, but they felt like they had no choice. So beginning of November 1918, sailors on a bunch of ships in Kiel, they mutiny.
Oh.
They take over the ships, raise red flags. It's basically the start of the German Revolution.
Wow. So Germany's trying to make peace with the Allies, but they've got a revolution happening at home.
Yeah.
That's got to be impossible to deal with.
It really puts them in a bind. And remember, this revolution, it wasn't just about ending the war. They wanted big political changes. People wanted the Kaiser gone. They wanted a republic.
Wow. So Wilson's talking about this new world order, and Germany's in the middle of this massive upheaval.
Yeah.
I mean, could the German negotiators even focus on Wilson's ideas at that point?
That's a good question. You got to think their attention was pretty divided.
Yeah.
But even with all this chaos going on, the German delegation finally meets with Foch to work out the terms of the armistice. We have this really interesting account from Matthias Erzberger, the guy who led the German delegation.
Oh, okay.
He says the atmosphere was super tense. They met in Foch's train carriage tucked away in this forest clearing. And right away, Foch makes it clear who's in charge.
Really? Like how?
So Erzberger says in his memoir that Foch just opens the meeting by saying, I have no proposals to make.
Wow.
He basically forced the Germans to beg for an armistice before he even told them the terms.
That's bold.
Yeah, Foch definitely knew how to take control.
But wasn't he also under pressure from the other allies? Like,
Mhm.
could he really just demand whatever he wanted?
Right, good point. He had to consider what Britain, Italy, and of course the U.S. wanted, but Foch had the advantage for sure.
Yeah.
And the terms he gave them, pretty harsh. Germany had to leave all the territory they'd occupied, surrender tons of weapons, and let the Allies take over important strategic locations.
Oof. Sounds like the German delegation was stuck.
Yeah.
Needed peace, but at what cost?
Exactly. Erzberger was horrified. He thought those terms would lead to famine, anarchy, maybe even a Bolshevik takeover in Germany.
For those of us who might not remember all the details, what did a Bolshevik takeover even mean back then? Why was it such a scary idea?
Right, so the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, they had just taken over Russia, made it a communist state,
Right.
and their whole thing was getting rid of capitalism and redistributing wealth. A lot of people in Europe, especially the folks in power, saw Bolshevism as this dangerous, contagious ideology.
Yeah, like it would have said everything.
Exactly. And Erzberger and others, they were worried that the armistice terms, because they were so tough, would make Germany vulnerable to a Bolshevik revolution.
Wow. It's crazy how one event, like the war toppling the Tsar, leads to the Bolsheviks. And now that's a threat to Germany.
Yeah, it shows how connected everything is.
So with everything going on, were the Germans able to get Foch to back down at all?
They got a few small concessions, but nothing major. One of the biggest sticking points was the Allied blockade of Germany.
Right, that was brutal. It was meant to starve them into submission.
Yeah, very controversial, even back then. Erzberger was adamant that keeping the blockade after the armistice was basically continuing the war, just in a different way. He even got into a big argument with one of the British admirals about it.
But in the end, Germany had no other options, right?
Nope. They had to accept. And as if things weren't bad enough, while this is all happening, things in Germany get even worse. The Kaiser has to abdicate, they declare a republic, and now Erzberger is negotiating for a government that doesn't even exist anymore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the pressure must have been unbelievable. And remember, the clock is ticking. They had 72 hours.
So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, in that train carriage, in the cold French forest, they signed the armistice.
A truly historic moment. The whole world was watching, hoping this would actually be the war to end all wars.
And on the front lines, the reactions must have been all over the place. What was that like?
It's crazy, right? You have the news spreading, and it's like this mix of relief and disbelief and just confusion. Like, can you imagine years of fighting, the noise, the death, and then silence?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to picture that change, going from this world of violence to, at least you'd hope, no more killing. Do any of the accounts, really capture that?
Yeah, we have one from an American soldier, Captain Bob Casey. He wrote in his diary, "The silence is oppressive. It weighs in on one's eardrums." Like, it's almost like they couldn't process that it was actually over.
Yeah, I get that. After so much noise, wouldn't silence feel, I don't know, wrong? I remember reading about soldiers from both sides meeting in no man's land, like shaking hands, sharing cigarettes, even hugging.
It's amazing, right? Trying to kill each other one day, then the next, finding this, common ground in the relief. Some people even described soldiers dancing together in the trenches.
We also have some voices we've heard before, people we talked about in past deep dives who were there that day.
Oh, right.
Remember Grace Banker, the hello girl?
Yeah, the one who worked the switchboards.
Yeah, her. She said she just couldn't believe it. It was surreal to think the war was over. She'd been connecting all these calls between military leaders, hearing about battles, casualties. The sudden peace must have felt so strange.
Yeah, like a total disconnect.
Totally. And what about Colonel William Hayward, the commander of the Harlem Hellfighters?
Oh, yeah, Hayward. What a guy. He was so proud of his men, you know? They fought so bravely, even with all the racism they faced, at home and overseas. He said November 11th was the second greatest day in history, right after the birth of Christ.
That's powerful. And it's amazing to think about this moment, how it affected people all over the world. For the people who'd actually been through it, the armistice must have felt miraculous.
Absolutely. But along with the celebrations, there's also this really heavy reality, the cost of the war. Millions dead, whole countries destroyed, a whole generation marked by what they'd been through.
Right. And it's so important to remember that human cost. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the battles, the politics, and forget about the individual lives that were lost or just completely changed.
You're right. And we have this one story that's especially heartbreaking about Henry Gunther. He was this young American soldier, and he was killed just 1 minute before the armistice took effect.
Oh, I know. That one always gets me. To be so close to surviving, to peace, and then, it's just such a reminder of how random and cruel war can be.
It really highlights that even as everyone's celebrating, people were still dying. Peace is a process, It's not just flipping a switch. It takes more than just stopping the fighting.
And there were so many who survived but were forever changed by what they went through.
Exactly. A report from the U.S. War Department said that almost 7.5 million soldiers died in World War I.
Wow.
That's more than all the deaths in all the wars in the previous 100 years combined. And that's not even counting those who died from diseases or the millions who were wounded.
It's hard to even wrap your head around those numbers. And even though the U.S. joined late, over 125,000 American soldiers died.
A whole generation lost. And that loss shaped the world in so many ways.
So as we wrap up our deep dive on the armistice, it's just this wave of emotions.
Yeah.
Relief, sure, but also what's next? Is this really the end of war like everyone's hoping?
That's the big question, isn't it? The armistice was just this pause, a moment of peace in a world still recovering from all the trauma.
Yeah.
The real test was what came next. Could they rebuild? Could they prevent another war?
And that's a story for another deep dive. We'll get into the Treaty of Versailles, the challenges of making a lasting peace, and all the things that happened because of this moment. Thanks for joining us as we explored the armistice, a day of, so many feelings that marked the end of one thing but left so much still undecided.